There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, and the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and fear of the God of Lord. And his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide disputes by what his ears hear. But with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth. And with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. Righteousness shall be the belt of his waist, and faithfulness the belt of his loins.
Thank you, Amy. Appreciate that so much. Phil and Amy, of course, run Life Challenge. He's a part of our home church, and we're just so thankful to have him here, so thank you for that. Thank you for all of you for being here. Yeah, you can give her a hand. Thank you to all those. It's so wonderful to see those beautiful kids and their joy. And what a touching tribute to Beverly for her years of service to this church. That reading today was from Isaiah chapter 11, verses 1 through 5. Now listen, I thought it seemed like a nice Sunday to do this. The kids were up here singing. They were sharing their talents. I thought it would be beneficial for you to hear my talents this morning. Would you like to hear my talents this morning? Okay, it's not an overwhelming response, but that's okay. So I'd like to sing a Christmas carol for you. This is called "O Christmas Tree." You know that song? "O Tannenbaum, O Christmas Tree." So I'm going to sing that for you this morning, okay? I actually have the first verse up here. Feel free to sing along if you'd like to. O Christmas tree, how lovely are thy branches. O Christmas tree, how lovely are thy branches. Your boughs so green in summertime. Started too high. Stay bravely green in wintertime. O Christmas tree, how lovely are thy branches. There it is. Not bad, not bad. Now I'd like to sing another song for you. Is that okay? If I can do a concert. This is a song I've written. Thank you, Pastor Phil. This is called "O Christmas Stump." Ready? This is an original by Pastor Tim. Copies are available in the lobby. And it goes like this. I'm going to try to start a little lower. Oh, Christmas stump. I'm in the same key. Oh, Christmas stump, you're really not that lovely. Oh, Christmas stump, you're really not that lovely. You're dead and brown, it's plain to see. Your life is through, unfortunately. Oh, Christmas stump, you're really not that lovely. So that was "Oh, Christmas Stump." Not the happiest Christmas carol that's ever been written, but I think it has a purpose, and the purpose comes from our text today, in which I've entitled this short message, "Oh, Christmas Stump." There are a lot of words that are inspiring, especially this time of the year. Hope, joy, love, peace. Stump is not one of those words. Nobody has when they hear the word stump, nobody's filled with joy, nobody's overwhelmed by happiness. If you have a stump in your yard, I can almost guarantee you that when company's over and you're out in the back, maybe it's summer and you're having a grill out, you say, "Oh boy, that stump, I got to do something with it, I tell you. It's been there for years. Got to grind it down or something." No one wants that stump there. The stump is a very, very disrespected thing in this universe, I think. But it doesn't need to be. The scriptures show us that there's actually great value sometimes in stumps. That God can bring really good things out of stumps. You see, a stump is something that once was. For every stump that you see at one time was a tree. And that tree had to be cut down. And all that remains as a memory of that tree is that lowly stump, sitting there by itself. Nothing good can happen to a stump, we might think. But God disagrees with that assessment. God brings beautiful things out of stumps. He brings beautiful things out of things that are despised by the world. So you might feel like a stump today, and the world might feel like a stump, and the culture might feel like a stump. But I want you to know that God loves to bring new life out of dead stumps. The reading today was from the prophet Isaiah. one who came before the Christ, prophesying about his coming, looking forward 700 some years before him, that one day God would establish order in his world through his Messiah. You see, God's people, Israel, were always in some kind of trouble. They never really knew how to be obedient to God. They never really knew how to follow his commands. And this led to centuries of discouragement. They would often find themselves under the power of ruling empires. In this case, it was the Assyrian Empire. It was growing. It was casting its shadow over them. And in this time, God's people find themselves not unsure of what to do. They're not surrendered to God. They're not living for him. They're deaf and they're blind. They lack concern for God and for each other. And that's exactly why prophets existed. To come to the people of God and to say, you've forgotten about God. You've forgotten about his commands. You've forgotten how to serve him and to love him. And so the prophets come with harsh words, not for the world as we might like it to be or tend it to be, but for the church itself. A church that was viewed, or the people of God, I should say itself. Church isn't quite the right language for the Old Testament prophets, but coming to the people of God, saying, look what has happened to you. Your disobedience, your inability to follow God has caused this, and now you're in trouble. But if you reach out to him, if you seek God again, he will return to you and grant you his favor. And Isaiah is particularly beautiful because he has a present picture of Israel's restoration that also had a future purpose. That is to say that Isaiah, more than any other Old Testament prophet, saw something. He saw the Christ coming. He didn't know exactly when or how, what he would look like or what he would do, but that God would send forth a Messiah that would reestablish Israel forever. That would be like something new out of an old dead stump. And that's the point that the writer makes to us when he refers to the stump of Jesse. Jesse was the father of one of Israel's most famous figures, King David. He was their King Arthur, the one who had done things right, who had established Israel as a prominent power, so to speak, had given them a place to belong, something to believe in, and even promises of a future kingdom. See, David was the one who killed the bear and the lion. David was the one who slayed Goliath. But David was not without his problems, to be sure. A sinner is how we would call him. Unsure of himself. A womanizer. A womanizer that led him to murder, in fact. And ultimately, it's this lack of character, this lack of divine trust that leads to a loss of his line. When Isaiah speaks of the stump of Jesse, he's talking about David's royal line coming to nothing. What started out with so much promise remains now as only a stump. Only something in which nothing good seems to be left. So the prophets saw that things were going to get very bad for the people of God. David's line would decline to such a degree that it would be left like a stump, something without any real value. And this is exactly what happened. David's royal line, his royal dynasty, so to speak, died out. Israel never really got the power that they wanted. It was Assyria at once, and then it becomes Babylon, and then ultimately, when Jesus the Christ comes, it's Rome. And all the time, what they really want is somebody that will come from David. So it's not just a small thing, after all, that when a virgin named Mary and her husband named Joseph see through the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, he comes from David's line, the promised king that would come from him. So Isaiah sees something unique, that although the line of David seemed to be dead, life would remain within that stump. Something good would still come from it. A shoot, barely detectable at first, something that nobody noticed would emerge from that dead stump. Something new that God was doing in the world would happen. And once this shoot goes forth, once this new branch comes out of the stump, it would become a mighty thing indeed. It would be God's establishing again of his order in all of the created world. Here's what I want you to know this morning. God brings new life out of dead stumps. Never forget that. He sees things as they ought to be seen, and he sees a stump. And when everyone else sees something that's dead and gone and past its prime, God sees an opportunity for resurrection. This is what God does. He's a resurrection God. He brings dead things back to life. It's no coincidence then that when the Bible writers talk about salvation, they liken it to a dead person coming back to life. Someone who's lost in darkness and sin and death and despair, having come to know the true shoot, the true heir of David, receives new eternal life. It is no surprise then that God himself uses the crucifixion and burial of his very own Son, Jesus Christ, to demonstrate this power of resurrection that he's still doing today. So you might be a stump yourself. You might be questioning all kinds of God's purposes. You might be questioning even the own direction of your own life. Well, I have news for you this morning, Stumpy. God's got his eye on you. And God loves resurrection. He loves to bring new things out. He loves to bring resurrection where there was previous death. And Isaiah tells us that this king that is to come will rule with the very Spirit of God, that God's Spirit will rest on him. Just as it was said at Jesus' baptism when he goes down to the Jordan River to be baptized by his cousin, John the Baptist, that when he ascends out of the water, the Spirit of God descends on him like a dove. This is a fulfillment of what Isaiah saw. That this one from God, this shoot out of the deadness and the despair of the stump of Israel, would be a new kind of thing altogether. For Isaiah, the Spirit baptism of Jesus is one of wisdom and understanding, of counsel and of might, of knowledge and of fear of the Lord. Here is this Jesus, the fulfillment of this expectation, the shoot out of the stump, the tender shoot out of dry ground, as Isaiah would later say, the one conceived by the very Spirit of God. The one in whom the angel would come to his mother and say, the Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you, and your child will be born, will be called holy. He will be the Son of God, the one who is overflowing with and filled with and overshadowed by the very Spirit of God. And his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. And Jesus grows in wisdom and in stature under this Spirit baptism. Jesus knows that as he grows older, he becomes aware of his calling. This is a fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy. It is important for us to remember this morning, this Christmas season, this year, that Jesus is, yes, loving and kind and generous and meek and true. And he is also wise. Having been baptized in the spirit of wisdom and understanding, of counsel and might, he is not missing the details of our life that matter the most. So if you feel as though you are nothing but a stump, don't think Jesus doesn't know what to do. He's wise. He's been given the spirit of wisdom and understanding. He sees the stumps, and he understands that out of that stump comes new life. He sees opportunity for resurrection. Isaiah says in that passage that we read, he said, he will not judge by what his eyes see, or decide disputes by what his ears hear. Now think about that. That does not mean that Jesus did not see anything or hear anything. Jesus perceived many, many things. He saw them with his eyes, and he heard things with his ears. That does not mean he was unaware of what was going on around him. So what does Isaiah mean when he says he will not judge by what his eyes see or discern by what his ears hear? He means he will see things as they really ought to be seen. In other words, Jesus, unlike us, actually knows the truth. And this is manifested in his life and ministry. When Jesus sees people, he doesn't see them as everybody else sees them. He doesn't simply see a beggar on the side of the road. He sees a child of God in need of a miracle. He doesn't just see a woman caught in adultery. He sees a child of God in need of forgiveness. He doesn't just see evil people crucifying him. He says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. In other words, he doesn't just see with natural eyes, he sees with supernatural eyes. That's what it means that Jesus is wise. That he sees beyond what we see. That he understands beyond what we understand. And that he is able to rightly discern what needs to be done about it. This is not something that any human being can lay claim to. There's no person, no pastor, no leader anywhere that can lay claim to this. Only Jesus Christ, the true King, the one who has come out from the stump of Jesse, the one who is the promise of God, the resurrection and the life. So Jesus gives us something that nothing else can give us. That is the truth. The unabridged, unedited truth about ourselves, about the world, and about how we interact in that world. Because He's the Messiah. He's the one who has come to us to give us wisdom and revelation. And that's why it's so important that we trust Him. If Jesus is so wise, understanding and discerning, filled with counsel and the knowledge and fear of the Lord, that shows me something. That means that we should not be afraid to understand that sometimes it may be Jesus who created the stump in the first place, who cuts down trees, who trims the vine so that new growth might come forth. Christians labor under a burden that they've never been asked to labor under. In fact, they've been asked in times to realize something completely different. And that is to say that they labor under the burden that the devil is responsible for all the problems in their life and in the world. Now, how do I know that that's a burden that need not be bared all the time? Well, first off, I'd like to say that sometimes the enemy of your soul will attack, will cause problems, will cause despair, but he is not the only one who's afraid, or he is not the only one who's willing to cut back. You see, God Himself is not afraid to pull out a pair of clippers, to pull out an axe and lay it to the root of the tree, because His wisdom allows Him to cut us back that new growth might come forth. Jesus said that He was the true vine, that is to say, the vine that was truly established in righteousness and in truth, and that His followers would be like vines, tendrils, branches that go off of that vine. And then He said something really interesting. He said, "My Father in heaven is the vine dresser." He's like the gardener that goes through with clippers and will clip those branches back. First off, He'll look for ones that don't bear fruit and He'll cut them off. And secondly, perhaps more alarming than that, something that's convicting to our souls even today, that even branches that bear fruit, He'll take the time to trim them and to cut them back so they'll be even more fruitful. Here is a tough statement that we must have ears to hear. We may be a stump because God cut the tree. That sometimes God, in His love for us, decides that we need something better than what we currently have. Proverbs chapter 3 reminds us that because He's like a father who loves us, He disciplines us accordingly. Nobody wants to discipline their children, but if it's done right, and if it's done out of love, it's the greatest gift of love that can be given, because it establishes a pattern for their life that will allow them to prosper. And God's desire is to discipline us in such a way that it allows us to prosper. So there's more to this idea of being a stump than simply life is hard, this is hard, that is hard, but sometimes being willing to see with spiritual eyes that perhaps God Himself is not afraid to level some of our growth off, to cut down the trees we're so proud of, all the accomplishments, all the things that we think are so good, and to lay us bare before Him so that out of that dead stump can grow new life. This is what Jesus does better than anything. He tells us the truth about the world. He perceives things as they ought to be perceived. That's why the writer can say that He will strike the earth with the rod of His mouth in Isaiah. What's that mean? It means the things that He speaks, by their very nature, judge the world. By their very nature, strike down the high and lofty ideas of men and of women. Jesus is the truth teller. This is why Paul can say in Romans, "Let God be true, and every man a liar." He understands that people aren't really capable of seeing ultimate truth, that they're biased in every possible way, but not Jesus. He sees it, and He strikes the earth with the rod of His mouth. And when Jesus strikes the earth with the rod of His mouth, trees fall. Things change. They cannot go on as they are. And yes, that means the church too. God looks to us because He loves us and He values us too much to allow us to persist in the ways that we're so insistent on persisting in. Jesus' ministry on earth was very much coming to a people who had become dead. The religious leaders of Jesus' day, He likened them to graves that were clean on the outside but full of dead bones on the inside. He likened them to a saucer that was clean on the outside and dirty on the inside. He talked about the very temple of God, the centerpiece of their history, of their story, of their revelatory gift from God to them, that it was like a fig tree that had failed to produce any fruit. And because of that, needed to be cut down and destroyed. So we must not labor constantly under this idea that every time we face hardship or a cutting back, it's the work of the devil or of other men or of even leaders, but God himself, doing what only a loving God can really do, loving his children enough to cut them back, to challenge them, to cause them to see what can come out of something that once was and something that needs to be today. Because God always has a plan to bring forth life. Here's the beautiful thing about the ministry of Jesus. Jesus' ministry was a judgment on the wickedness of the world. It was a judgment on those powers and principalities that lead people away from God and towards sin. When Jesus hangs on a cross between two thieves, he is allowing the sin and the shame of the world to be absorbed into his flesh and to be crucified there with him. When Jesus is buried into the earth, he takes all of those things with him down into the earth. Jesus' ministry was very much about judgment, but he didn't judge the world the way that everyone thought he would, or even the way that the Jews thought he would. Instead, naked and alone, he allows himself to be judged. He takes that upon himself. He takes the judgment of the world on his own shoulders, and he buries it. But here's the good news. And here's the shoot growing out of a stump that we're talking about this morning. Jesus' crucifixion was not just judgment on the wickedness of the world. It was also vindication for the good things that God wanted to bring into the world. Jesus became like a seed that resurrected from the dead. He said it himself, that he was like a seed being buried in the ground. And when he grew up out of that, when he popped forth from the earth under the power of God and of the Spirit, he made way for another kind of shoot to grow. A shoot that shows all that's good in the world. A shoot that overcomes evil. As wickedness was taken down into the grave, the seed began to grow. They would grow into justice and mercy and joy and peace and forgiveness and love. Something new that the world had never really seen before. For unto us a child is born. Unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulders. And his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. This is the new kind of root, bringing forth new kind of life. I don't know about you, but I would sure like to see a little bit more of the Prince of Peace and a little bit less of everything else. And we all have our part to play in this. Christ invites us to set about doing his business in the world, to look for all the dead and barren places in our culture, all the ways in which we've forsaken God and his Christ, all the ways in which we rebel against God, all the ways in which we insist on doing things our own way, despite God's many warnings to us. And he gives the people of God a new kind of hope, a new kind of vision for the future. His people, set apart, different, a holy people, with watering cans of God's love and grace, looking for all the dead and barren places and watering them with the good news about Jesus Christ. And watching those new branches spring forth, because God always brings new life out of dead places. If you look around and you perceive or you feel what many people feel and perceive, that we are in new times and different times and challenging times, and you recognize the ways in which that world is dead and barren, please insist on watering it with the good news about the gospel of Jesus Christ. Don't turn to counterfeit versions of change that will not do what you expect them to do. The church of Jesus Christ is called to him and to his good news and to his message. And they are called to go forth into the world with that resurrection life, watering and nurturing all those dead and brown and barren places that are so common in the world then and the world today. And out of that death comes new life. Out of those stumps springs forth a shoot. So you may feel like a Christmas stump, but God does amazing things with Christmas stumps. And you may look around and you may think there's not a Christmas tree anywhere to hang any decorations on, nothing but stumps. But God does amazing things with stumps. He brings new life out of them. So you shouldn't despise yourself, or you shouldn't despise the world, or you shouldn't despise the culture when it's down and everything feels stumpy, because God brings beautiful things out of that. God does something new when no one else can. Do you remember our dreary, depressing Christmas song that I sang at the beginning of this service? Oh, Christmas stump, you're really not that lovely. Oh, Christmas stump, you're really not that lovely. You're dead and brown, it's plain to see. Your life is through, unfortunately. Oh, Christmas stump, you're really not that lovely. That's a Charlie Brown Christmas song if you've ever heard one. But that's not the song you should be singing. Because the people of God understand that God brings new life out of stumps. So if you are tempted to sing that version, don't sing it. I want to give you another song, another original Tim Pike song that I wrote for you this morning. And this is the song you should learn to sing about what God does with stumps. And it goes like this. Oh, Christmas stump, you really seem quite lonely. Oh, Christmas stump, you really need to trust me. You may feel dead and brown, you see, but I'll use you for my glory. For when I make something new, I love to use a stump like you. And that's the good news about Jesus Christ. Even when you seem down, even when you seem dead, even when things seem to be without hope, that's God's favorite place to work. Isaiah saw it long before Jesus even came. He understood that God never quit on anything, and that sometimes the best place for him to create new life is out of a stump that appears dead to everyone else. So will you stand with me this morning as we